Hello again, everybody. This is attorney Mark Brunner, and thank you so much for joining me today here on Talking Texas Law. Well, today let's look at an offense that's seemingly pretty simple, but it has some complexities to it, has some nuances, and that is the offense of evading arrest or detention. This comes to us out of Section 3804 of the Texas Penal Code. And the crime is committed when someone intentionally flees from a person that they know is a peace officer, law enforcement officer, who is attempting to lawfully arrest or detain them. So seemingly real simple. If you flee from an officer, someone that you know is a peace officer who's attempting to arrest or detain you, and you're doing this intentionally, that is the offense of evading arrest here in Texas. So what are some of the complexities of that seemingly straightforward offense? Well, let's look number one at intentional. So someone has to be intentionally fleeing. If you have a scenario where, let's say, someone's driving on the road and they don't realize the police officer is behind them, the officer may be getting mad that this person's not immediately pulling over, but maybe the driver is distracted. Several opportunities to pull over present themselves. The person doesn't take it, only then later realizes, oh my gosh, this officer's been on my tail for 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 minutes, and I'm just now realizing this and pulling over. Well, the officer may feel that person was attempting to flee or evade, and that simply may not be the case. So there may be factors there. I had a scenario one time where a defendant I was representing was hunched over on a motorcycle going very fast. And just the design of this motorcycle, the rearview mirrors were up over where his head was, because his head was crouched down so low as he was going so darn fast on that motorbike. So the officer who had been following him for many, many miles with his lights and sirens on, my client could just flat out not hear or see that police officer was behind him until he slowed down. And when he slowed down, his body language kind of got him back up to where he could then see his side mirrors and realize, oh my gosh, I have an officer on me all this time. So again, to that officer, we've got someone who's fleeing, who's not pulling over for miles and miles and miles, but to the defendant, it's, oh my gosh, I wasn't paying attention. So unless the state can prove the intent to flee, not merely just that it was an accident or someone was negligent in not pulling over quick enough, unless the state can prove that intent to flee, they can't really make that offense stick. Let's look at some of the other nuances here. The defendant has to know that the person they're not pulling over for or stopping for is actually a peace officer, a law enforcement officer. Sometimes this gets odd when you're talking about unmarked cars, when you're talking about perhaps undercover officers, people dressed in street clothes. Maybe it's a sketchy neighborhood, and people don't respond well to the sight of a guy walking down the street in jeans and a t-shirt and a gun, and someone says, hey, I'm the police, and maybe there's not that level of trust, and so people start scattering. Is it a police officer? Is it not? There's a lot of factors that can go in through there. So in a classic scenario, you've got perhaps in a vehicle, you've got a marked police car with the lights and sirens going. It's perfectly obvious that's a police officer. Sometimes that's not the case. Again, if it's a pursuit on foot, usually it's officers, again, wearing uniforms and the badges, and they've got the gear and the tactical vest on, and they're saying the right things. But again, sometimes that's not the case. You may be talking about someone, again, like an undercover narcotics officer dressed very casually, dressed in street clothes, who all of a sudden, produces a badge and a gun, and at 50 or 100 yards is yelling at someone else in the dark to stop. And the facts can be very critical in a case like this, whether someone is intentionally fleeing or not from someone that they do know is a peace officer or not. And lastly, there has to be an attempt to lawfully arrest or detain. If it's just the intent to question somebody without a true detention, there may be some fact issues there about what the officer was actually trying to do. Was it supposed to be a lawful arrest or detention? If it was an unlawful arrest or an unlawful detention, then there is no crime there. So again, the state has to prove those several elements like they do in many cases. So again, it's got to be an intentional fleeing. It's got to be from a person that the defendant knows is a peace officer, and it's got to be a lawful arrest or detention that peace officer was trying to effect or make on that defendant. So missing some of those elements, then that case cannot be substantiated by the state. So let's talk about also some of the different penalties that Texas can lay on somebody for this offense, for this relatively straightforward offense. It can be either a felony or a misdemeanor depending on how the crime went down. If it's a pursuit on foot, an evasion on foot, a foot chase, that is simply a Class A misdemeanor, having a range of punishment up to a year in jail or up to 2 years probation, up to a $4,000 fine. However, if the evasion includes a motor vehicle or a watercraft, or someone has been previously convicted of the misdemeanor version of evading previously, they've done it again. Now we're talking about at least a state jail felony, and it can go up from there. So can be a misdemeanor, can be a felony, and it can even be a more serious felony if someone sustains serious bodily injury during the flight, during that pursuit. Let's say a bystander gets hit, or there's a car accident and someone else gets hit. Or again, it could be an even more serious offense, up to a second-degree felony if, God forbid, someone gets killed during that chase. It doesn't have to be by the defendant. I mean, a fleeing officer in their vehicle could lose control of their car, hit a bystander, kill them, and guess what? The fault's not to the law enforcement officer. The fault is to the defendant who is fleeing. So again, what could be anywhere from a relatively straightforward, simple misdemeanor all the way up to a second-degree felony with a few stops in between, that is the offense of evading arrest or detention here in Texas. Here's the usual disclaimer. This video is being offered for educational and informational purposes only. It's not to be construed as giving specific legal advice and is no substitute for a legal consultation. And unless you are already a contracted client of mine, I'm not your lawyer. This is Attorney Mark Brunner, and thank you so much for joining me today here on Talking Texas Law. I'll see y'all next time.